So we're gonna take a look at the greatest possible argument, the ontological argument. Yes, and it is the greatest possible argument. And today we're gonna go through why that is. Now the ontological argument was made roughly 1,000 years ago by Saint Anselm. Very smart man once again. And what he came up with was the greatest possible argument. And it goes something along the lines of this. God is defined as the greatest possible being. The idea of the greatest possible being exists within our mind. But if God is only an idea, then we can conceive of a greater possible being, meaning that would not be the greatest possible being, and so the greatest possible being has to exist in our mind and also in reality. And therefore God, checkmate atheists. And so basically the next time an atheist says, but there is no God, just say to them, well, if there is no God, then why does he live in your head rent-free? Checkmate atheists. And so, what are some criticisms of the greatest possible argument? Well, some people point out that, well, what do you mean this has to exist, this thing that we can think of? Well, very simple. The idea of the greatest possible being exists in everyone's mind, including the non-believer's mind. They have a concept of the greatest possible being. And because we have that concept, it has to exist somewhere. And you might be saying, well, that doesn't make any sense. But think about it like this. None of our thoughts and ideas are 100% original. Think about vampires. Are vampires original? No. Some dude went and saw some cannibal tribe drinking blood or something, and now they're like, those guys, wow! And then they run back to their own tribe and tell a story about this pale people who drinking blood and stuff, bro, vampires. Or what about dragons? Are dragons original? No. Somebody went and saw a big lizard during a wildfire, and then they, oh, what's that? A lizard breathing fire? And so none of our ideas are actually original. They're always based upon some reality. And well, if you disagree, then try inventing something that is not related to anything that actually exists. Try it. Try thinking of something that just in no way relates to anything that is real. I think it's impossible. Now, of course, if you think you have an answer, you can maybe comment it down below. And so if none of our thoughts are original, then what does that mean? Well, that surely means that the thought and the idea of the greatest possible being has to come from somewhere as well. And what would that be? Well, it could be God. See, that's why we have this idea, and why ideas that we can have, and especially when they're the greatest possible being, they also have to exist. Because none of our ideas are actually original in nature. Oh, the greatest possible argument getting even more amazing now, isn't it? Now, the epic criticists had some epic criticisms to say. But cannot we just say that there is an island? The greatest possible island, that there is no other greater island, and now that island certainly has to exist. Well, let's look at that criticism and see if it holds. So for this greatest possible island to exist, same with the greatest possible being, it surely needs to be in everyone's mind, even in the non-believers. And it surely has to come from somewhere, just like the idea of the greatest possible being comes from God. And well, not many people think about the greatest possible island. So even though we know where the idea of an island comes from, it comes from, well, islands that we can see, the idea of the greatest possible island actually doesn't really make sense, because try conceiving of the greatest possible island. Can you conceive of one? What does it even look like? Can you even think of what abilities, what things would that island even hold? What characteristics would it have? You probably cannot even conceive of anything remotely like it, but with God you can conceive of some sort of, oh, well, it's some sort of all-powerful nature and so on. But if you're to say that this greatest possible island is supposed to exist, then it's like, well, okay, what is even the greatest possible island? I mean, the greatest possible being has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all those things, but what is even the greatest possible island? Does it become a god? That the island now is all-powerful, all-knowing, omniscient, all of these things? Like, so, like, are you just conceiving of God, but you call it an island because that's basically what it ends to? And if it's not literally becoming God, then how can it be the greatest possible island? I mean, surely you can always conceive of a slightly better island that has slightly more consciousness, slightly more power, slightly more knowledge. So eventually you will end up in it just becoming the greatest possible being, and we will be at the same point. The greatest possible being has to exist, and well, that's the only greatest possible being that can exist. There is no other greatest possible anything except God. Another way you can look at this and simply say that, well, okay, the greatest possible island does exist. And now they're like, whoa, what do you mean the greatest possible island does exist? Like, where? And you say, well, yeah, it does exist in heaven. Checkmate once again. The greatest possible pizza in heaven. The greatest possible tree in heaven. The greatest possible coffee in heaven. I mean, we can just keep going forever. I mean, damn, the greatest possible argument, the ontological argument, keeps just getting better and better. I mean, what an amazing argument, isn't it? And so, is this the greatest possible argument? Well, I simply cannot conceive of a greater possible argument than the ontological argument, so surely it has to be the greatest possible argument. And that's simply how it works. It exists in my mind as the greatest possible argument, so surely in reality it must also be the greatest possible argument. Anyway, thanks for watching and have the greatest possible day.